Chapter 6. About this time, an ambitious young reporter from New York arrived one morning at Gatsby's door and asked him if he had anything to say. Anything to say about what? Inquired Gatsby politely. Why, any statement to give out. It transpired after a confused 5 minutes that the man had heard Gatsby's name around his office in a connection which he either wouldn't reveal or didn't fully understand. This was his day off, and with laudable initiative, he had hurried out to see. It was a random shot, and yet the reporter's instinct was right. Gatsby's notoriety, spread about by the hundreds who had accepted his hospitality and so become authorities on his past, had increased all summer until he fell just short of being news. I love that idea. He fell short of. He almost became important to be news. Contemporary legends, such as the underground pipeline to Canada, attached themselves to him. And there was one persistent story that he didn't live in a house at all, but in a boat that looked like a house, and was moved secretly up and down the Long Island shore. So the underground pipeline to Canada reference is probably a reference to bringing in booze from Canada. Just why these inventions were a source of satisfaction to James Gatz of North Dakota isn't easy to say. James Gatz. That was really, or at least legally, his name. He had changed it at the age of 17, and at the specific moment that witnessed the beginning of his career, when he saw Dan Cody's yacht drop anchor over the most insidious flat on Lake Superior. It was James Gatz who had been loafing along the beach that afternoon in a torn green jersey and a pair of canvas pants, but it was already Jay Gatsby who borrowed a rowboat, pulled out to the Ptolemy, and informed Cody that a wind might catch him and break him up in half an hour. I suppose he'd had the name ready for a long time, even then. His parents were shiftless and unsuccessful farm people. His imagination had never really accepted them as his parents at all. The truth was that Jay Gatsby of West Egg, Long Island, sprang from his Platonic conception of himself. He was a son of God, a phrase which, if it means anything, means just that. And he must be about his father's business, the service of a vast, vulgar, and meretricious beauty. What's meretricious? Probably regarding like meritocracy. Meretricious being like the more beautiful you are, the more you get of something, or the better you are at something, the more you get.
Apparently attractive, but having in reality no value or integrity.
Ooh. Don't call your girlfriend meretriciously beautiful. Or your boyfriend. So he invented just the sort of Jay Gatsby that a 17-year-old boy would be likely to invent. And to this conception, he was faithful to the end. So it's important to note, I think, a couple of things, right? One is that Gatsby is really becoming the embodiment of the American dream. And by embodiment, I mean just like the symbolic representation of the American dream. Just like if you watch like The Dark Knight, Batman is like the symbolic representation of like justice. Gatsby is the symbolic representation of what Fitzgerald is saying about the American dream, which is a couple of things, right? One, he's saying that Gatsby invented this idea as a 17-year-old boy, and he was faithful to the end, right? So he's like, this is everything Gatsby has created, the mansion, his attire, his behaviors, all of that of like a 17-year-old, which is to say like stupid, immature, and romantic, right?
Mm-hmm. He never grew from there either.
He never grew at all, right? That's kind of one of his points, right? Is that he just like stayed there. So I think part of what Fitzgerald here is saying, right, is that yeah, the American dream is something that a 17-year-old would come up with, right? But it's not actually something that's real. It's not something that has been like thought through or is meaningful. And then the other, interesting thing also, right, is this idea of imagination, right? So we've got this fact that all of this was just in his imagination as a kid. It was not anything real. It was just Gatsby living in a false reality where he assumed all of these things would be able to come true at some point. And here we are, which is that he has still, now he's starting to end up with something, hopefully, maybe. Anything else?
I was just saying like the shiftless and unsuccessful farm people, that's kind of like they're just doing the same thing over and over again. They're not successful at doing it. Mm-hmm. And I think that's kind of like exactly what you were saying. Like he can't believe that this is his life. Mm-hmm. And that's why he kind of invents something that's exactly the opposite.
Mm-hmm. But also, there's this idea that the American dream is this idea that America is a place where you can remake yourself, right? And that's what Gatsby does. He literally changes his name. He creates a new version of himself. For over a year, he had been beating his way along the south shore of Lake Superior as a clam digger and a salmon fisher, or in any other capacity that brought him food and bed. His brown, hardening body lived naturally through the half-fierce, half-lazy work of the bracing days. He knew women early, and since they spoiled him, he became contemptuous of them, of young virgins because they were ignorant, of the others because they were hysterical about things which in his overwhelming self-absorption he took for granted. So we already have this idea that he's already self-absorbed with himself, and that he's already become kind of like, not necessarily a womanizer, right? But he got a lot of attention from women early on, so he already started to kind of like not value them, right? Mm. But his heart was in a constant and turbulent riot. The most grotesque and fantastic conceits haunted him in his bed at night. This idea that he's got like nightmares, kind of. A universe of ineffable gaudiness spun itself out in his brain while the clock ticked on the washstand and the moon soaked with wet light his tangled clothes upon the floor. Each night he added to the pattern of his fancies until drowsiness closed down upon some vivid scene with an oblivious embrace. For a while these reveries provided an outlet for his imagination. They were a satisfactory hint of the unreality of reality, a promise that the rock of the world was founded securely on a fairy's wing. So this is him in bed every night, just like dreaming, right, and imagining his future of having lots of money and having all these different things, right? An instinct toward his future glory had led him, some months before, to the small Lutheran college of St. Olaf in southern Minnesota. He stayed there 2 weeks, dismayed at its ferocious indifference to the drums of his destiny. He's dismayed that they don't accept the great dreams and aspirations that he has. The ferocious indifference to the drums of his destiny, to destiny itself, and despising the janitor's work with which he was to pay his way through. Then he drifted back to Lake Superior, and he was still searching for something to do on the day that Dan Cody's yacht dropped anchor in the shallows along shore. So note that we've got this idea that that Gatsby is given an opportunity to pursue something that's very American, right? Which is go to college, get a degree, become better than your parents. And he decides against it because he doesn't like the actual work that's required, right? He's like, oh, this is beneath me. I'm not going to do that.
That's exactly what I was going to say. It's beneath what he's built himself to be in his mind, right? Mm-hmm. And then it also is like a parallel to me of is it Oxford? Mm-hmm. What was it? Yeah, mm-hmm. It's the Oxford story, right? He went there for a little while and then he just left. Mm-hmm. So he kind of created that story out of St. Olaf, you know?
Very much so, yeah. And so we've got this idea that while people say they value hard work and they're willing to do whatever it takes, clearly, as Gatsby is showing here, people are not willing to do whatever it takes. They want the easier route, or at least they want the route that is, I don't know, like somehow the route that they deserve, even though, do we actually really deserve anything at all? Like a lot of you guys, if I were to ask you, how much value can you give somebody as an employee? How much money can you make somebody? Probably not a whole lot of money right now, right? So it's like, how much am I actually worth right now from a capitalistic standpoint? Cody was 50 years old then, a product of the Nevada silver fields, of the Yukon, of every rush of metal since 75. The transactions in Montana copper that made him many times a millionaire found him physically robust, but on the verge of soft mindedness, and, suspecting this, an infinite number of women tried to separate him from his money. I love this idea that if he finally built him up to be physically robust and super rich, but his brain is becoming deteriorated, so he can't actually enjoy it. The none too savory ramifications by which Ella Kay, the newspaper woman, played Madame de Maintenon to his weakness and sent him to sea in a yacht were common knowledge to the turgid journalism of 1902. He had been coasting along all too hospitable shores for 5 years when he turned up at James Gats's Destiny at Little Girl Bay. Wait, so did this lady marry him and then basically send him on a yacht to live?
Yeah, that's what it sounds like. I didn't look up who that is, but I'm sure that that's some lady that's like marries an old rich man, like the original one that married the old rich man for his money.
Not a Black Widow or a Black Widow? Only a Black Widow if they kill the person, right?
I think so, yeah. Because Black Widows kill.
Right, so again, we've got this idea of what does this lady want? She wants to climb the social ladder and achieve the American dream, and how does she do it? She does it by taking advantage of an old man who doesn't think straight. To the young Gats, resting on his oars and looking up at the railed deck, the yacht represented all the beauty and glamour in the world. I suppose he smiled at Cody. He had probably discovered that people liked him when he smiled. Notice that people like Gatsby from the surface, right? At any rate, Cody asked him a few questions. One of them elicited the brand new name and found that he was quick and extravagantly ambitious. A few days later, he took him to Duluth and bought him a blue coat, 6 pair of white duck trousers, and a yachting cap. And when the Tuolumne, that left for the West Indies and the Barbary Coast, Gatsby left too. He was employed in a vague personal capacity. While he remained with Cody, he was in turn steward, mate, skipper, secretary, and even jailer. For Dan Cody sober knew what lavish doings Dan Cody drunk might soon be about, and he provided for such contingencies by reposing more and more trust in Gatsby. So notice that Gatsby does not. This is like how Gatsby starts to make his money, right? By getting in with Cody. But notice that again, the American dream of work hard, work towards your dream, and then you achieve it and you can become rich is not what Gatsby does, right? He decides against that plan, and instead the only way he does it is by becoming lucky, right? So it's almost like Fitzgerald's like, the American dream doesn't exist, it's only luck. It doesn't matter how hard you work, it just matters who you happen to run into. The arrangement lasted 5 years, during which the boat went 3 times around the continent. It might have lasted indefinitely, except for the fact that Ella Kay came on board one night in Boston, and a week later, Dan Cody inhospitably died. Black Widow.
Black Widow.
A Black Widow is a woman who marries a rich man, and then that rich man ends up dead shortly thereafter. Thus giving Tiger King, thus giving the women all the money. And then I guess a black widower would be a man doing that to a rich woman. I remember the portrait of him up in Gatsby's bedroom, a gray-floored man with a hard, empty face. Another empty face, right? Another empty person. He's rich, but he's empty. He has nothing. The pioneer Debauchee, who during one phase of American life brought back to the eastern seaboard the savage violence of the frontier brothel and saloon. It was indirectly due to Cody that Gatsby drank so little. Sometimes, in the course of gay parties, women used to rub champagne into his hair. For himself, he formed the habit of letting liquor alone. So again, he doesn't drink at his parties, but he gives drinks to everybody around him. And how did Cody make his money? Did Cody make his money with brothels, saloons, and mining? Is that how?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think it was the gold mines they just referenced earlier.
Mm-hmm. And it was from Cody that he inherited money, a legacy of $25,000. He didn't get it. He never understood the legal device that was used against him, but what remained of the millions went intact to Ella Kay. He was left with his singularly appropriate education. The vague contour of J. Gatsby had filled out to the substantiality of a man. He told me all of this very much later, but I put it down here with the idea of exploding those first wild rumors about his antecedents, which weren't even faintly true. Moreover, he told it to me at a time of confusion, when I had reached the point of believing everything and nothing about him. So I take advantage of this short halt, while Gatsby, so to speak, caught his breath to clear this set of misconceptions away. It was a halt, too, in my association with his affairs. For several weeks I didn't see him or hear his voice on the phone. Mostly I was in New York, trotting around with Jordan and trying to ingratiate myself with her senile aunt, but finally I went over to his house one Sunday afternoon. I hadn't been there 2 minutes when somebody brought Tom Buchanan in for a drink. I was startled, naturally, but the really surprising thing was that it hadn't happened before. They were a party of 3 on horseback, Tom and a man named Sloane and a pretty woman in a brown riding habit who had been there previously. "I'm delighted to see you," said Gatsby, standing on his porch. "I'm delighted that you dropped in." Notice again, though, that, Gatsby had not, invited him over, right? So, Gatsby had used Nick for his value to him, just like their, capitalistic relationship. And after Nick had delivered the goods, which was Daisy, Gatsby doesn't, really care about Nick anymore.
Doesn't really talk to him.
I'm delighted that you dropped in. As though they cared. "Sit right down. Have a cigarette or a cigar." He walked around the room quickly, ringing bells. "I'll have something to drink for you in just a minute." He was profoundly affected by the fact that Tom was there, but he would be uneasy anyhow until he had given them something, realizing in a vague way that was all they came for. I love that idea that he's that Gatsby finally realizes that, all these people come for is the booze and the good time. They don't come for him. Mm-hmm. They don't care about who he is. Mr. Sloane wanted nothing. "A lemonade? No, thanks. A little champagne? Nothing at all, thanks." "I'm sorry. Did you have a nice ride?" "Very good roads around here." "I suppose the automobiles?" "Yeah." Moved by an irresistible impulse, Gatsby turned to Tom, who had accepted the introduction as a stranger. "I believe we've met somewhere before, Mr. Buchanan." "Oh, yes," said Tom, gruffly polite, but obviously not remembering. "So we did. I remember very well. About 2 weeks ago." "That's right. You were with Nick here." "I know your wife," continued Gatsby, almost aggressively. "That's so?" Tom turned to me. "You live near, Nick? You live near here, Nick?" "Next door." "That's so." Mr. Sloane didn't enter into the conversation, but lounged back haughtily in his chair. Haughtily, a great SAT word, meaning with too much confidence. The woman said nothing either, until unexpectedly, after 2 highballs, she became cordial. "We'll all come over to your next party, Mr. Gatsby," she suggested. "What do you say?" "Certainly, I'd be delighted to have you." "Very nice," said Mr. Sloane, without gratitude. "Well, think ought to be starting home." "Please don't hurry," Gatsby urged them. He had control of himself now, and he wanted to see more of Tom. Why don't you stay for supper? I wouldn't be surprised if some other people dropped in from New York." "You come to supper with me," said the lady enthusiastically. "Both of you." This included me. Mr. Sloane got to his feet. "Come along," he said, but to her only. "I mean it," she insisted. "I'd love to have you. Lots of room." Gatsby looked at me questioningly. He wanted to go, and he didn't see that Mr. Sloane had determined he shouldn't. "I'm afraid I won't be able to," I said. "Well, you come," she urged, concentrating on Gatsby. Mr. Sloane murmured something close to her ear. "We won't be late if we start now," she insisted aloud. "I haven't got a horse. I used to ride in the army, but I've never bought a horse. I'll have to follow you in my car. Excuse me for just a minute." The rest of us walked out on the porch, where Sloane and the lady began an impassioned conversation aside. "My God, I believe the man's coming," said Tom. "Doesn't he know she doesn't want him?" "She says she does want him." "She has a big dinner party, and he won't know a soul there." He frowned. "I wonder where in the devil he met Daisy. By God, I may be old-fashioned in my ideas, but women run around too much these days to suit me. They meet all kinds of crazy fish." Remember, Tom is having affairs with, everyone.
So, of course, this is,
He's like, "These women. Where's my next affair?" Suddenly, Mr. Sloane and the lady walked down the steps and mounted their horses. "Come on," said Mr. Sloane to Tom. "We're late. We've got to go." And then to me, "Tell him we couldn't wait, will you?" Mr. Sloane doesn't even try to, apologize to Nick.
Yeah.
Tom and I shook hands. The rest of us exchanged a cool nod, and they trotted quickly down the drive, disappearing under the August foliage, just as Gatsby, with hat and light overcoat in hand, came out the front door. Tom was evidently perturbed at Daisy's running around alone, for on the following Saturday night, he came with her to Gatsby's party. So note again, this is kind of representation of the difference between the new money and the old money, right? Literally, the old money doesn't want the new money Gatsby to go with them. Mm-hmm. He's still separated. Gatsby still has not achieved his dream of actually climbing the social ladder. He has money, but he doesn't have the inclusion that he wants exactly. Perhaps his perseverance gave the evening its peculiar quality of oppressiveness. It stands out in my memory from Gatsby's other parties that summer. There were the same people, or at least the same sort of people. I love that idea, right? I remember these people are the rich people who have achieved the American dream are just meaningless, empty vehicles. So he's like, well, they're mostly the same kind of people, same thing. They were the same people, or at least the same sort of people, the same profusion of champagne, the same many-colored, many-keyed commotion, but I felt an unpleasantness in the air, a pervading harshness that hadn't been there before. Or perhaps I had merely grown used to it, grown to accept West Egg as the world complete in itself, with its own standards and its own great figures, second to nothing, because it had no consciousness of being so. And now I was looking at it again through Daisy's eyes. It was invariably saddening to look through new eyes at things upon which you have expended your own powers of adjustment. They arrived at twilight, and as we strolled out among the sparkling hundreds, Daisy's voice was playing murmurous tricks in her throat. Daisy's voice keeps coming up a lot, actually. Mm-hmm. Nick keeps talking about how her voice is kind of like very like appealing, and draws people in a lot, like a siren almost. That she's like, her voice like just like brings them into her, right? And then she's just like a rocky outcrop that's going to break up their ships. These things excite me so, she whispered. If you want to kiss me any time during the evening, Nick, just let me know and I'll be glad to arrange it for you. Just mention my name or present a green card. I'm giving out green. Look around, suggested Gatsby. I'm looking around. I'm having a marvelous... You must see the faces of many people you've heard about. Gatsby. Like, hey, look around. I'm going to impress you with all the people who come to my party. Tom's arrogant eyes roamed the crowd. We don't go around very much, he said. In fact, I was just thinking... I don't know a soul here. Perhaps you know the lady, Gatsby indicated, a gorgeous, scarcely human orchid of a woman who sat in state under a white plum tree. Tom and Daisy stared, and that peculiarly unreal feeling that accompanies the recognition of a hitherto ghostly celebrity of movies. She's lovely, said Daisy. The man bending over her is her director. He took them ceremoniously from group to group. Mrs. Buchanan and Mr. Buchanan. After an instant's hesitation, he added, the polo player. Oh, no, objected Tom quickly, not me. But evidently the sound of it pleased Gatsby, for Tom remained the polo player the rest of the evening. Gatsby gives out titles to people. Yeah.
Well, also I think it's like he's never accomplished really anything. Like he's the polo player.
Oh, yeah. That's like if you're 34 years old and someone refers to you as the polo player, which is like, it's like not a professional sport. Yeah. So it's like not great. It'd be like if someone like introduced you as like, oh yes, this is the croquet champion of East Vacaville. Yeah. Have they done anything else? No. That's all. Gatsby identified him, adding that he was a small producer. Well, I liked him anyhow. Wait, what? Oh, no, sorry. I've never seen so many celebrities, Daisy explained. I liked that man. What was his name? With the sort of blue nose? Gatsby identified him, adding that he was a small producer. Well, I liked him anyhow. I'd a little rather not be the polo player, said Tom pleasantly. I'd rather look at all these famous people in oblivion. Daisy and Gatsby danced. I remember being surprised by his graceful, conservative foxtrot. I had never seen him dance before. Then they sauntered over to my house and sat on the steps for half an hour, while, at her request, I remained watchfully in the garden. In case there's a fire or a flood, she explained, or any act of God. Tom appeared from his oblivion as we were sitting down to supper together. Do you mind if I eat with some people over here? He said. A fellow's getting off some funny stuff. Go ahead, answered Daisy genially. And if you want to take down any addresses, here's my little gold pencil. She looked around after a moment and told me the girl was common but pretty. And I knew that except for the half hour she'd been alone with Gatsby, she wasn't having a good time. So Daisy knows. right? What Tom's up to.
Yeah, exactly. But then it's funny because she's like, "Here's my pencil." Like,
oh yeah, it's like they're
real petty. Like,
yeah, they're fighting basically. Yeah. They're like who can hurt each other's feelings the most is how Daisy and Tom's marriage is going right now. Mm-hmm. We were at a particularly tipsy table. That was my fault. Gatsby had been called to the phone, and I'd enjoyed these same people only 2 weeks before. But what had amused me then turned septic on the air now. Something septic is like an infection. How do you feel, Miss Badaker? The girl addressed was trying, unsuccessfully, to slump against my shoulder. At this inquiry, she sat up and opened her eyes. What? A massive and lethargic woman, who had been urging Daisy to play golf with her at the local club tomorrow, spoke in Miss Badaker's defense. Oh, she's all right now. When she's had 5 or 6 cocktails, she always starts screaming like that. I tell her she ought to leave it alone. I do leave it alone, affirmed the accused hollowly. We heard you yelling, so I said to Doc Civet here, there's somebody that needs your help, Doc. She's much obliged, I'm sure, said another friend, without gratitude. But you got her dress all wet when you stuck her head in the pool. Anything I hate is to get my head stuck in a pool, murmured Miss Bedecker. They almost drowned me once over in New Jersey. Then you ought to leave it alone, countered Dr. Civet. Speak for yourself, cried Miss Bedecker violently. Your hand shakes. I wouldn't let you operate on me. It was like that. So we've got, she was screaming, and the only way they could shut her up was like putting her head into the pool to like wake her up for a second, right? And then the doctor is so much of an alcoholic that his hands shake. So he can't do his job very well. It was like that. Almost the last thing I remember was standing with Daisy and watching the moving picture director and his star. They were still under the white plum tree, and their faces were touching except for a pale, thin ray of moonlight between. It occurred to me that he had been very slowly bending toward her all evening to attain this proximity, and even while I watched, I saw him stoop one ultimate degree and kiss her at her cheek. I like her, said Daisy. I think she's lovely. But the rest offended her, and, inarguably, because it wasn't a gesture, but an emotion. She was appalled by West Egg, this unprecedented place that Broadway had begotten upon a Long Island fishing village, appalled by its raw vigor that chafed under the old euphemisms, and by the too obtrusive fate that herded its inhabitants along a shortcut from nothing to nothing. She saw something awful in the very simplicity she failed to understand. A lot of interesting things have just been touched on, right? We've got this, we've got the movie director and the star where like his whole evening, it's as if he choreographed it and directed it, and his whole plan was to like be able to kiss her. And he spent the entire evening trying to figure out how to do that instead of just kissing her. And then we've got this idea that Daisy doesn't like West Egg. And remember, she comes from old money, so part of what she doesn't like is she doesn't like the new money. She doesn't like, the upper classes rejecting the people who have tried to make it. Mm-hmm. But also, what is it? She saw something awful in the very simplicity she failed to understand. I don't know what it is that was simple that she failed to understand. Was it that she failed to understand that these people were working for their money?
I think that's what it is, yeah. That's right. Like, oh, they think that they're rich. Mm-hmm. Like, they don't really have money. Mm-hmm. Like, seriously, it's kind of like setting that apart. Like, even Daisy is one of those people. Mm-hmm. Yep.
So even Daisy doesn't understand that work is how money is usually acquired, not just given to you.
And it's sort of like kind of without trying to be, it's like a cut at Gatsby because that's how he got there.
Mm-hmm. It's true. It also is interesting that we've got Nick here saying, right, that these people are going from nothing to nothing, right? They've started nowhere, and what they wanted to achieve was so shallow that once they achieve it, they still have nothing. Mm-hmm. Right? We've got Fitzgerald saying that if this is all you focus on, you still you still have nothing. The American dream is a pursuit of nothing. I sat on the front steps with them while they waited for their car. It was dark here in front. Only the bright door sent 10 square feet of light volleying out into the soft black morning. Sometimes a shadow moved against a dressing room blind above, gave way to another shadow. How indefinite possessions of shadows. An indefinite possession of shadows who rogued and powdered in an invisible glass. Rogued or rouged? I don't know. Who is this Gatsby anyhow? Demanded Tom suddenly. Some big bootlegger? Where'd you hear that? I inquired. I didn't hear it. I imagined it. A lot of these newly rich people are just big bootleggers, you know. Not Gatsby, I said shortly. So we've got Tom who's being like, well, there's some good ways to make money and there's some bad ways to make money. And Tom's like, I was given my money, so that means it was a good way. So if you do it this way, though, it's a bad way. He was silent for a moment. The pebbles of the drive crunched under his feet. Well, he certainly must have strained himself to get this menagerie together. A menagerie is a big, glass shelving unit that you put all of your nice china and glassware in to show off in your house. Usually. A breeze stirred the gray haze of Daisy's fur collar. At least they're more interesting than the people we know, she said with an effort. You didn't look so interested. Well, I was. Tom laughed and turned to me. Did you notice Daisy's face when that girl asked her to put her under a cold shower? Daisy began to sing, with the music in a husky, rhythmic whisper, bringing out a meaning in each word that it had never had before and would never have again. When the melody rose, her voice broke up sweetly, following it in a way contralto voices have, and each change tipped out a little of her warm, human magic upon the air. Lots of people come who haven't been invited, she said suddenly. That girl hadn't been invited. They simply forced their way in, and he's too polite to object. And this is how they feel about Gatsby and the people there, that they're forcing their way into the upper class with them, with Daisy and Tom. And Daisy and Tom don't want them there, right? They don't accept them. I like to know who he is and what he does, insisted Tom, and I think I'll make a point of finding out. I can tell you right now, she answered. He owns some drugstores, a lot of drugstores. He built them up himself. The dilatory limousine came rolling up the drive. Good night, Nick, said Daisy. Her glance left me and sought the lighted top of the steps where, 3 o'clock in the morning, a neat, sad little waltz of that year was drifting out the open door. After all, in the very casualness of Gatsby's party, there were romantic possibilities totally absent from her world. What was it up there in the song that seemed to be calling her back inside? What would happen now in the dim, incalculable hours? Perhaps some unbelievable guest would arrive, a person infinitely rare and to be marveled at, some authentically radiant young girl who, with one fresh glance at Gatsby, one moment of magical encounter, would blot out those 5 years of unwavering devotion. And so now we've got Daisy's scared that Gatsby's going to be taken by another girl, right? Another woman.
Jealous.
Yep. I stayed late that night. Gatsby asked me to wait until he was free, and I lingered in the garden until the inevitable swimming party had run up, chilled and exalted from the black beach, until the lights were extinguished in the guest rooms overhead. When he came down the steps at last, the tanned skin was drawn unusually tight on his face, and his eyes were bright and tired. She didn't like it, he said immediately. Of course she did. She didn't like it, he insisted. She didn't have a good time. He was silent, and I guessed at his unutterable depression. I feel far away from her, he said. It's hard to make her understand. You mean about the dance? The dance? He dismissed all the dances he had given with a snap of his fingers. Old sport, the dance is unimportant. So we've got the one time that they're actually engaging with each other, and Gatsby's like, that doesn't matter. Yeah. What matters is the whole show didn't impress her. He wanted nothing less of Daisy than that she should go to Tom and say, I never loved you. After she had obliterated 3 years with that sentence, they could decide upon the more practical measures to be taken. One of them was that after she was free, they were to go back to Louisville and be married from her house, just as if it were 5 years ago. Remember in the Crash Course, he talks about how Gatsby just wants to relive the past, which is impossible, right? But that's all he wants to do. He can't move forward productively. He is not really capable of that. He's trapped by the past. And she doesn't understand, he said. She used to be able to understand. We'd sit for hours. He broke off and began to walk up and down a desolate path of fruit rinds and discarded favors and crushed flowers. Notice the things that are the waste that's been created, right? We've got fruit that's been wasted. We've got favors, and we've got flowers, right? We've got all these things that are generally beautiful, and now they're just waste on the ground. I wouldn't ask too much of her, I ventured. You can't repeat the past. Can't repeat the past, he cried incredulously. Why, of course you can. He looked around him wildly. He looked around him wildly, as if the past were lurking here in the shadow of his house, just out of reach of his hand. I'm going to fix everything, just the way it was before, he said, nodding determinedly. She'll see. He talked a lot about the past, and I gathered that he wanted to recover something, some idea of himself, perhaps, that had gone into loving Daisy. His life had been confused and disordered since then, but if he could once return to a certain starting place and go over it all slowly, he could find out what that thing was. One autumn night 5 years ago, before they had been walking down the street when the leaves were falling, and they came to a place where there were no trees, and the sidewalk was white with moonlight, they stopped here and turned toward each other. Now it was a cool night, with that mysterious excitement in it which comes at the 2 changes of the year. The quiet lights in the houses were humming out into the darkness, and there was a stir and a bustle among the stars. Out of the corner of his eye, Gatsby saw that the blocks of the sidewalk really formed a ladder and mounted to a secret place above the trees. He could climb to it if he climbed alone, and once there he could suck on the pap of life, gulp down the incomparable milk of wonder. This is all symbolic about what he could do alone, right? What he could do if he left. His heart beat faster and faster as Daisy's white face came up to his own. He knew that when he kissed this girl and forever wed his unutterable vision to her perishable breath, his mind would never romp again like the mind of God. So he waited, listening for a moment longer to the tuning fork that had been struck upon the stars. Then he kissed her. At his lips' touch, she blossomed for him like a flower, and the incarnation was complete. Also notice that he's comparing her to a flower, right? And how long do flowers blossom? Not very long, right? It's a very, very short period of time.
A season, as they say.
And then it's dead. Through all, he said, even through his appalling sentimentality, I was reminded of something, an elusive rhythm, a fragment of lost words that I had heard somewhere a long time ago. For a moment, a phrase tried to take shape in my mouth, and my lips parted like a dumb man's, as though there was more struggling upon them than a wisp of startled air. But they made no sound, and what I had almost remembered was uncommunicable forever.
You feel sorry for him.
Mm-hmm. Yep. Because it's very sad if you were to have a friend who was like Gatsby, who literally said to you, "I can change. I can repeat the past and make it better. Mm-hmm. I can fix the past." And they were pining over this person who is married. You'd feel really bad for this friend of yours, because they're just living in a fantasy, right? Mm-hmm. Gatsby's dreaming, and he cannot get his dream.
Yeah, then that's why he can't speak. He's just I don't know what to say to this guy, because you're gonna have to ruin his life with the truth, or ruin his life by not telling him that he's crazy.
Yep, both ways his life is ruined.
Mm-hmm.